Okay, good evening, guys. I'm sorry that the in-class lecture did not work, so I'm going to try and record this again. Hopefully it'll work for you. If you have any questions, please just let me know. But I'm going to try and go through the slides that I presented in class on Wednesday on qualitative research. So let me just share my screen here with you guys. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. So the first thing that I was talking about, I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware about the midterm exam. And I know that's probably, these first few slides are the things that you guys are the most interested in hearing about. So the midterm will be taking place next Wednesday in class, and you will have a full 3 hours to do that exam. Obviously, you can leave before that if you're done in time. It will be out of a total of 90 points, of which 20 of those points are coming from a multiple choice format on the exam. So there'll be 20 questions. And the remaining 70 points are coming from short answer questions. Now, this is actually going to be a little bit different from probably a lot of other exams that you have written before, because certainly there are going to be some questions related to theory. And what I mean by theory is the actual concepts that I presented in the slides that I went through with you guys in every class. So these would be the concrete concepts that we talked about, whether they be related to statistics, whether they be related to how to find research articles, whether they be related to what makes a good research article. That's what I mean by theory. There will also be quite a few application questions, and these questions are essentially testing your ability to perform critical appraisal. So the way that this will work is you will actually be given articles and you will be asked questions to answer on the exam that are very much testing your ability to perform in a critical appraisal on that paper. So the interesting part about this is that on Monday morning, on February 29th, I will actually post the 2 articles of which all the theory questions are going to be focused on Blackboard. So there'll be a folder called Midterm, and if you click on it and open it up, there will be 2 articles in there that will actually be the ones that I want you guys to be prepared for on the exam. So you will obviously have Monday and Tuesday and up until Wednesday on the exam to read through those articles and do whatever you would like to do with them. So certainly meet with friends if you want to talk with friends about it. Go through some of the checklists that you have to make sure that you understand the paper, the strengths and the weaknesses of the paper. Because once you arrive in the 3 hours, you will not have enough time to actually start from scratch and read the paper. So the few students that I did have last year that chose not to read the papers in advance did not come close to finishing the midterm. So I would strongly, strongly recommend to have those papers read and somewhat evaluated before you walk into the midterm, okay? When you show up for the exam, certainly bring your student card. That's just sort of standard policy. I would also recommend bringing a calculator. It is not mandatory. You can certainly do this exam without a calculator, but your life will probably be a little bit easier if you do have a calculator. There will be some very basic mathematical equations you need to sort out. Very basic, not complicated, but it certainly will make your life a little bit easier if you do have a calculator. So I would recommend bringing one. What you will not be allowed to bring in, I will provide you with any checklist that you might need for the completion of this exam. So the consort, the STARD, and the correct checklists, if you need them for the exam, they will be provided to you. Same with all of the CAST checklists. You will have those provided to you in the exam. The 2 papers that you will have been given ahead of time, you will also be provided with a copy of those papers in the exam. So you are not allowed to bring in your own. I want you to have unmarked copies when you're writing this exam, okay? The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention before I start this week's lecture is the assignment. So a reminder to you that the week after the midterm, so not this coming Wednesday, but the Wednesday after that, your assignment will be due. This assignment, again, is going to be on one of the 3 papers that you have been presented in class. So either the paper related to the randomized controlled trials, the paper related to diagnostic trials, or the paper that we'll talk about, or I'll highlight today, related to qualitative trials. And here's a summary of the different things that you need to actually present to me in your assignment. And just as a heads up, the date at the top here, this should actually say the 9th, not the 10th. That's a typo. So you're going to have a summary. You're going to have one of the checklists done very briefly, and I am going to upload an example of that for you. I want you to complete the appropriate CASP checklist in more detail, as well as an overall impression of strengths and weaknesses of the article that you read. All the details on how I will actually evaluate these assignments are available online in a very detailed rubric. So I would highly recommend that you actually take a peek at that rubric before you start writing the assignment if you haven't already done so. Okay, so before I jump into the qualitative research, I also provided to the class on Wednesday a bit of a review regarding diagnostic tests and some of the performance characteristics that are typically presented within a diagnostic test paper, because these can be extremely confusing, even for people who are well versed in this area, and certainly can be very challenging for students to remember what all of these different things mean. So you were provided with this slide of the definitions of what all of these different terminologies mean. And certainly, I have no doubt that a lot of you will just memorize these terms, and that's fine. But what I wanted to do is do a very quick exercise with you so that you can understand how you might actually apply these different terms to understand some of the results that might be presented in a paper. So I gave this example here. So imagine that there was a trial that was performed, and this trial was aimed at assessing the diagnostic performance of a new urine-based test that would determine whether a growth that was observed in the prostate was malignant or benign. And we were going to test this new urine-based test against the gold standard, which is a standard biopsy of prostate tissue. In this trial, we enrolled 657 men. And then this following table down here was actually presented in the paper, and it shows their performance results for the diagnostic test. So as you can see up here, we have the information related to this new test to predict prostate cancer. So over here on the left, we have what's called the true positive rate. And this is basically saying that in this trial, there was 86 malignant prostate cancer cases. So 86 people truly had prostate cancer. And on this side here, you can see that 571 of them actually had benign growths. And of those 86, the ability to detect cancer in those individuals, we detected cancer. We had a positive test result in 68 out of 86 of those individuals. This same test at the same time also gave a positive response for 6 people out of 571 that did not have prostate cancer. So this is a false positive rate. So it is very possible that in a paper, this would be all of the information that you are given. You're given the total number of people enrolled, you're given a true positive rate and a false positive rate. And so what do you do with this information? So it would be very, very feasible of me to ask you to be able to fill out a 2x2 contingency table. So in class, because I'm recording this on sort of my own time, I'm not going to sort of pause and give you guys time to do this, but I would suggest if you want to try and pause the video at this point and figure out if you can figure out how to fill in this table. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide and show you how I went ahead to do this. So if we look at a contingency table, the way a contingency table is set up is that at the top you have what's called the reference test. So this is your gold standard test where we definitively know whether in fact a person is disease positive or disease negative. Over here we have the index test, or the test that we're actually testing, and that test can give you a positive result or it can give you a negative result. And what you need to do is fill in this table according to the data that was provided up here. Okay, so what do we know? So of the people who we know 100% had the disease and also tested positive. So if we looked up here, our true positive rate, we said that 68 out of 86 cases that were really malignant tested positive. So 68 would be the number that would fill in this box here. And 86 would actually be the sum of this whole column, because this is all the people who were disease positive. So if these are all the people who were disease positive, This was the number, 68 was the number that were actually tested positive. That means that there were another 18 people who had malignant prostate cancer who tested negative. So you could fill that just by subtraction, you can fill out this column. And you can do the same thing over here for the disease negatives. We know 571 is the total number of people who were disease negative. So that's the total at the end of this column. Of those, 6 of them were disease negative but tested positive, so that would be this column here. And the difference between those were disease negative and also tested negative, and that's 567 right here. So when Samantha was actually giving you the lecture on this, she gave you a slide that looked something like this, where she showed you how you could actually go about calculating sensitivity and the specificity of all of these different things. And it's basically indication of what these different things are really telling you. So sensitivity and specificity, you can think about these as calculations that are moving down a column. So what they're saying, sensitivity is how many of the people who had the disease actually tested positive for the disease. So how good was this test at actually identifying the disease? So it's the true positives over all the people who actually were disease positive. Whereas specificity is looking at the other thing. It's really looking at ruling out disease. It's saying how many of those true negatives, D, were really identified over all the disease negatives. So it's ruling out disease. Positive predictive value and negative predictive value, they are actually working across the rows like this. So a positive predictive value is saying if you have a true positive test result, how likely are you to actually have the disease? And if you have a false positive, how likely is it that you actually don't have the disease? And an accuracy, on the other hand, is actually giving you a full diagnostic evaluation. So how good was this test at saying when you had the disease if you did have it, or told you that you didn't have it when you didn't actually have the disease? So it's looking at the true positives plus the true negatives. So this guy and this guy divided by all test result possibilities. So we could certainly go back to our 2x2 table that you had here, and you could plug in all of those different numbers to actually come up with sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value, and accuracy based on strictly those first few numbers that I gave you. So again, if I go back a couple slides, based strictly on these values right here, you could, in fact, calculate all of these different performance outcomes. And here's just an example of how that was in fact done. So doing the calculation is one thing, and that's certainly important. So certainly memorizing these equations can help you out in coming up with some numbers. But really what I'm looking for, and I want to be able to understand that you understand, is do you know what these numbers actually mean? So, you know, I could ask you to calculate them, but then I could also say, what does that number actually mean? And so we talked about in class what those actually mean. So a sensitivity of 79%, what that means is that this test correctly identifies 79% of all malignant tumors. A specificity of 99% says that this test correctly identifies 99% of benign tumors. So just based on these two things, we can say that this test is very good at detecting an absence of disease, and it's pretty good at detecting the presence of disease. The positive and negative predictive values are actually looking at something slightly different. So a positive predictive value is saying that if you tested positive, you have a 92% chance of actually having malignant prostate cancer. Or if you tested negative, you have a 97% chance of actually not having malignant cancer. And overall, if we were to do the math on all of these different tests, 96% of the time, what the test reported was true. Okay, so that was sort of the review that we did in class. I think it's important that those of you that weren't there have the ability to understand that discussion that we had. We're going to move on now to go through what qualitative research really is, the different methodologies that are employed within common qualitative research studies, as well as the methods, and how you analyze it We did have a brief discussion about some bias in qualitative research, and then again, we ended with the different types of checklists that you can use to ensure that qualitative research was done properly. Okay, so everything that we have done to date has been focused primarily on quantitative research or a quantitative approach to research. And this is really a study design in which we are looking to count or measure certain outcomes. So numbers are always at play. And really the fundamental thing that we're trying to assess in a lot of these quantitative measurements is a relationship of some sort, whether that be a cause effect, so you do something and this is the result, or an exposure outcome. So somebody is exposed to something or somebody is provided with a treatment and this is the outcome that we measure. And historically, this has certainly been recognized as sort of the acceptable form of research in health sciences. And in some cases, you would get people really saying that this is what true science really is. And unfortunately, this bias still exists. So you could certainly travel to a variety of different health science conferences today and run into these attitudes that are very much widespread. The good news is that really across the board, over at least the past 10 years, this attitude is really undergoing a massive shift. And this is particularly true in health sciences, because we're starting to realize that quantitative data on its own cannot actually solve all of the complex problems that we see in health. So really what qualitative research allows us to do is it allows us to really delve into the very sort of detailed complexities of life that may actually sway quantitative data in ways that we can't understand without looking into it. It's looking at social phenomena. By including qualitative research into a study design, you're really providing a very holistic perspective. So it allows you to look at all of the complexities of human behavior. And when you think about health, this is entirely important. So human behavior is certainly driving several aspects of human health. And so without taking account for that or ignoring that entirely when we come up with study designs is certainly negating massive contributions to health and disease. This is something that's really good to use when we're going into an area that we don't understand very well, or into an area where traditional quantitative research is really not making very much progress. It's a really strong indication that there are some sort of social phenomena at work here that need to be explored. So really what qualitative research looks at is the perspectives of the individuals that you're thinking about. So everybody can look at a piece of artwork and come at it from a completely different perspective. And really that's what we're examining when we do qualitative research. So this table sort of compares a lot of the different components of qualitative versus quantitative research. And I know you guys have taken some methods courses and probably looked at a lot of these different components here. So I'm not going to really harp on a lot of these. I do want to bring your attention to this row right here, which is related to reasoning, because this is really, from my perspective anyhow, the fundamental difference that you see between qualitative and quantitative research designs. When you think about quantitative research, what you see are individuals who go to the research, they read as much of the research as possible, they understand the structure or the theory of the disease they might be interested in. And based on the papers that are out there, based on the work that has been done previously, they come up with predictions. And these predictions we refer to as hypotheses. They come up with ideas on how things might be associated to one another. And then based on these predictions or based on the hypotheses, they design experiments to test those hypotheses. And what this is called is deductive reasoning. This is starting big, starting with a theory, and from that theory coming up with a hypothesis and then testing that hypothesis. And that really is how individuals approach quantitative research, really from a top-down approach. Qualitative research, on the other hand, for the most part, takes a completely opposite approach to research. In qualitative research, you usually start with the observation. So you start by observing behavior. You start by listening to people's dialogue, from that dialogue or from those observations, you start making generalizations or coming up with ideas of how things might work together. And from that, you more broadly come up with theories about human behavior or human social activity. And that's really how qualitative research works. And this is the process of inductive reasoning or bottom-up research. And these differences really account for some of the sort of friction between these two worlds, because really they're approaching research from two very different perspectives. So what can you do from qualitative research standpoint? So certainly you can ask questions related to behavior. Why are people behaving the way that they are? You can ask about opinions or attitudes. You can ask about how certain events in the world around us are influencing the way that we act or behave or think or believe. There's certainly an entire area of qualitative research focused to how cultures behave the way that they do, or how they function in a variety of different environments, and certainly some of the differences that we see in social groups. This list is certainly not exhaustive, but the three major research designs that we see in qualitative research are phenomenology, ethnography, and grounded theory. And we'll do a brief description of what each of those things are right now. So phenomenology is really studying the experience of an individual in their life. So this is looking at somebody's experience, their lived experience, and making a description of their lived experience. And this type of research is not necessarily done to come up with some concrete theories about human behavior, but instead is used to highlight certain aspects of human behavior or social phenomena. And I've just shown you a couple examples here. I went on PubMed and looked up a couple papers in health sciences that were using a phenomenology approach. So one was looking at young people's experiences of psychological interventions for tic disorders. So again, this is not building a theory, it's just saying if these individuals have had tic disorders, these are their impressions or experiences of what was successful and helpful as they moved through their treatment plans. The next is related to the characteristics of being hospitalized as a child with type 1 diabetes, really, again, focusing on a child's experiences. So really the key word here, and one of the sort of dead giveaways for a phenomenology type approach, is the word experience. They're often looking at somebody's explanation of their experience with a certain phenomenon. The next design is ethnography. And as we can see by the first point here, this is described really as a portrait of a people. So typically when you're using this study design, what you're doing is you're describing a culture or a group of people who share something in common. And this can be, this thing that's in common could certainly be a religion or an area of location, geography, but it could certainly be a shared experience. And in the context of health sciences, this shared experience could be a particular health career, for example. So it could be a study related to work practices for residents. So working extremely long hours if you're a resident, this culture of this is how things are done. This is your career stage. But what you're really examining when you're talking about ethnography is you're trying to describe characteristics of the culture itself. You're not describing an individual per se or an experience of that individual. You're trying to describe the culture itself. This type of research often requires extensive fieldwork and can be very time-consuming because individuals have to be, who are reporting on this, have to be very familiar with the culture that they are actually studying. And so a very good example of this that you see here in Ontario and certainly across Canada are a variety of health studies focused on Native populations. And in these cases, sitting, for example, in Ottawa and trying to report on these is not sufficient. That is not really a true ethnographic study. These individuals really need to go and live with the culture, understand how the culture functions, understand the types of healthcare offerings that they have, because they would be very different from the type of healthcare that we would receive here. And this does require a lot of effort and time and consideration. I've done the same thing here as I did with phenomenology. So here are some examples that I pulled off of PubMed of some studies related to health that were done with an ethnographic perspective. And certainly if you want to get a better sense of what these different types of studies are, please feel free to take a peek at these articles and understand how they approach this research topic. The last one I want to introduce to you is what's called grounded theory. Grounded theory has the ability to explore social phenomena, explore things that are happening in the social settings, people's behavior, people's attitudes, but to take that information and process it and use it to come up with a theory on human behavior or human attitudes, etc. So it's using experience to develop theory. And probably a really good example which can help explain how grounded theory could work in practice is the grief process. So I'm sure very many of you are familiar with the grief process and familiar with the different stages of grief that we're all taught about. Well, these stages of grief were learnt about through a grounded theory approach. So this would have been research projects that were following individuals through time who were going through the process of grief or loss, and hearing what these individuals were saying and taking detailed notes, etc., making observations of these people as they were going through the process of grief. And then evaluating their notes and noticing that, everybody at the front end of this process seems to very much be using terminology or discussing concepts related to denial. People who are a little bit farther along in this process seem to be very angry and talking about a lot of anger issues, etc. And it was through analyzing this data and sitting back and trying to come up with some sort of concept of how this all came together that they came up with the theory of how grieving takes place. Grounded theory is a very common research design when we're talking about health promotion and provision of care. So you can see a lot of papers where they're exploring at human behavior related to health, and then using their exploration of behavior to come up with a theory on how to better promote a variety of health provisions. So a lot of the papers that you see would be using a grounded theory approach. The types of data collection that they're using in these are often interviews, observations, etc. And the interesting thing about this is that in this type of research design, you are constantly collecting and analyzing data at the same time. So you would be running an interview, for example, analyzing the interview, understanding the direction of that interview, and then when you go to your next interview, tailoring that interview to sort of collect more data in that same direction. So you're always, the theory that you're generating as you move along is always grounded in the data that you're collecting. And again, as for the other two, here are some examples of papers that have used this theory. So how do we perform qualitative research? Well, I'm sure you're very aware of the idea of individual interviews, so sitting down one-on-one and discussing what's taking place. Focus groups are like interviews, but you have now more than one individual taking place in the interview. Observations are strictly that, so this could be in the form of a video camera set up in a room watching people interact with one another, or it could be somebody traveling to a site and actually looking around, taking pictures and taking notes. And then documentary analysis is typically related to looking at a variety of different documents, whether they be SOPs at a hospital or instructions provided from doctors to patients, etc. It would be going through these documents and trying to make sense of them. So let's go through these one by one just so that we make sure we cover all of our bases. So interviews, as I said, these are typically one-on-one. You have an interviewee and an interviewer. And if you were to watch this as an external viewer, you should actually be seeing these as a very much an informal process that looks like a conversation. If it's being done well, it's being conducted more like a conversation as opposed to a question answer session. There are three sort of ways to approach an interview. One being what's called highly structured. So in a highly structured interview, the interviewer would have a list of very rigid questions, and they would not deviate from this list of questions, and they would not allow the interviewee to really veer away from the direction of these questions. So they would make sure that they were just question, answer, question, answer. I put asterisks here because this is really not a very, this is not a structure that is highly touted within the realm of qualitative research. So this is not a good use of an interview to use it in this format. Instead, what you would more often see is what's called semi-structured interviews or unstructured interviews. So a semi-structured has some focus. An individual who's showing up for a semi-structured interview would certainly have a list of a variety of topics or questions that they would like to cover. But these are typically open-ended questions, and they certainly allow the individual who's being interviewed to explore concepts related to that question and veer away from the topic for a period of time. An unstructured interview or an in-depth interview, really the interviewer is coming to the table with only a couple topics to bring up. He will bring up these topics to prompt discussion with the interviewee. But what they're looking to do is to listen to the responses that are being given and to probe those responses to get more detail. And there's really, usually in these types of interviews, there are really no solid preconceived plans or expectations of what is supposed to be coming out of it. Focus groups, on the other hand, are not one-on-one. They are one individual who is leading a group of anywhere from 4 to 12 participants, and this can be face-to-face, or this could be on a telephone. And certainly the example of the paper that I gave you for this lecture was on a teleconference, so this certainly can be done through a teleconference format. So why would you use a focus group over an interview? Well, there's a variety of different reasons. The first and most obvious is if you have limited resources. So those resources could be time or money. So if you have a very short period of time to collect data, holding multiple one-on-one interviews that last 1 hour might not be really feasible. At the same time, if you can get up to 10 people in a room at one time and get multiple opinions at the same time, that certainly can help speed along the process. But there's really more to it when it comes to the benefits that come along with focus groups. Because in some cases, if you get a variety of people who have a shared experience together in the same room, you can get a lot of very rich information that is shared between these groups of people. And often you can get a lot more insight by watching the interactions between these different individuals. And for any of you who have taken any marketing research courses, certainly focus groups are a very popular means of performing market research. Observation, as I said, is really just watching individuals, watching their behaviors or reactions to a variety of situations. And I provided an example in class in which I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were looking at behaviors related to individuals who perceive themselves as being very wealthy versus individuals who perceive themselves as being poor. And the way that they did this was that they set up a Monopoly game, and they rigged this Monopoly game such that one participant showed up at the table with a lot more money than another individual showed up at the table. And all they did was set up a video camera and they watched these two people play Monopoly for 15 minutes and recorded aspects of the behavior that they were witnessing. And this is a very good example of how you could use observation to perform qualitative research. So it certainly can be on behavior, but it can also be on environment. So there are lots of cases, particularly in public health nursing, where they use environmental scans. So a public health nurse might be going out to do visits of homes, and while they're there, they're undertaking research where they're doing descriptions of the different living environments that certain patients might be living in. So often these are video recordings, photographs, but they can also be written descriptions. One of the other forms of the other methods used in qualitative research is document analysis. As I said, this is sort of a systematic way of looking through documents that might exist, whether they be in written format or electronic format, to try and gain meaning or understanding from these documents. And I gave the example of hospital SOPs or standard operating procedures. You could compare these different operating procedures across hospitals, for example, to assess different procedures that seem to work very well in getting a certain outcome, for example. But certainly there's a variety of different documents that you could assess for a variety of different reasons. Triangulation is a very important concept when you talk about qualitative research methods. So this is a way that allows individuals to assess the validity of the study. So now remember, validity is how close are you to getting at the truth, the real truth that exists in the world. So triangulation is a way in which in qualitative research, you can try and ensure that the results you're presenting are as close to the real truth as possible. So to try and tease out any bias that might be built into your trial. And certainly in qualitative research, there is quite a bit of room for bias within it. So how do you do triangulation? Well, just as you can imagine, you think about a triangle has multiple points. Triangulation refers to the fact that you're using more than one approach to investigate the same research question. And if you use multiple approaches and you come up with the same answer, then you can be very confident that the answer that you're coming up with is probably true. So data triangulation refers to the idea that you're going to use different sources of data, put those different sources of data together to try and come up with a common answer. Investigator triangulation means that you're using more than one investigator for the same measurements. So for example, let's say we did a focus group and we come up with a transcript of that focus group. So I could sit down and go through that transcript and try and pull out a variety of different major themes that I think exist in that transcript. Investor triangulation would say that another investigator would also sit down with that same transcript and also pull out their ideas of what the major themes were. And then the two of us would sit down together and actually assess how common our responses were and come up with the major themes that we both really agree on. Theoretical triangulation is really taking a variety of different research methodologies that I talked about, trying this from a variety of different ways so you can come up with the same way, and methodological triangulation, obviously using a variety of different methods. All right, so how do you actually get data? That's often the question when you talk about qualitative data. What is the data that you're getting? So often when you're performing, the most common forms of qualitative data collection are interviews and focus groups. And so certainly the data that you are collecting from these different research methods is the actual words that are being said by these individuals. And that's captured in the form of a transcript. So often what we have is somebody recording, whether it be audio recording or video recording, and then you have an individual or a program that's actually transcribing that into written text. But there's a lot of considerations that need to take place. And that's because the actual words that are said don't necessarily reflect the meaning of what was behind the words that were said. So when we sit in a room and we hear somebody and we watch their body language, we listen to the intonation of their voice, we can capture a lot more meaning than just the actual words themselves. And many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar of an email, for example, that's laced with sarcasm. It's very hard to interpret whether sarcasm is truly there or not. And so often people who are very good at doing qualitative data consider a lot of these things and try and put emphasis on different meanings or aspects of human behavior by coding their data using a variety of different things like punctuation or caps or fonts, for example. Once you have your transcript, you have to do what's called a content analysis. So this is our way of categorizing either the words or the behavior that was collected to try and classify or summarize what was actually taking place. So you have obviously a descriptive account of what, and this is really what was said, what did the people actually say, and there's an interpretive account, and that is what was actually meant by what was said. And again, this is taking in, again, more of that richer layer of concepts that you can extract by hearing and watching and listening to people. Once you have this data, you need to code the data. And often what happens is you first identify sort of common words or common sort of phrases that are said by multiple people, and you would categorize these as minor categories. So you would list all of those. And then what you would do is you would look at that list and you would try and lump together categories or keywords that seem to sort of track together. And those would fall under major categories. And then again, you would sort of lump those categories together to come up with some of the common themes that were discussed about in either the interview or the focus group. And here's just an example that I provided. So this would be an example. Let's say you were holding focus groups with a variety, a bunch of teenagers, and you were trying to determine what the needs were in regards to an outreach teenage health clinic program. And so you meet with teenagers and you probe them, ask them a few questions related to this topic, and then you look at the transcript and you notice the words safe sex, pregnancy, sexual behavior, smoking, alcohol, illicit drugs, etc. All of these words sort of come out on more than one occasion by a variety of different teenagers across the interview. So these all become listed down as sort of common keywords or minor categories. You then take a look at these and you try and reorganize them and lump them together in sort of common themes. So you have themes here related to sexual health, themes here related to drugs and alcohol, things here related to mental health, etc. And then you look at all of your major categories and you try and do that again. Can I lump these together into sort of bigger themes that might have come across? So one of them is related to very specific health issues. So here are a variety of health issues that are of interest to students. There are topics related to incentives for them to actually use the service. And then there are topics related to barriers, why they would not be able to use them. And then when you're reporting them, you're typically reporting on these biggest themes here. So here were the health issues identified, here were the incentives identified, and here were the barriers that were identified. So this seems like a very time-consuming and complicated process, and it is very challenging. However, there are some software programs that exist that really help with the ability to do that, and I've just listed 3 of them here, and many of them are available on a variety of different programs, computers across campus. So what about bias? Bias certainly exists in qualitative research, just like it does in quantitative research. You do have to be very, very cognizant of where qualitative research has the ability to have bias creep in. So just like the quantitative research studies that we talked about, sampling bias certainly is very important. So this is the consideration for the fact that the individuals that you have participating in the studies, those people that you have doing interviews or focus groups or that you're watching, truly are representing the population that you are trying to make conclusions about. So certainly if we think about that last example with teenagers, it makes absolutely no sense to run focus groups on senior citizens and ask them about the needs of teenagers. And if you did do that and you reported on that, there would be tremendous amounts of sampling bias built into that study. What you have in quantitative research is your researchers doing everything possible to remove themselves from the study. So there's blinding put in place, etc. In qualitative research, that inherently can't happen. So the researcher is very integral to the process that's taking place. And as a result, you need to think about some things that were not as relevant in quantitative research. And one of those is what we refer to as observer bias. And that means that the person that is sitting in the room and making observations, so the person who's making the transcript, the person who's writing down observations of the room around them, what they're bringing to the table certainly can influence how they're perceiving what is happening. Remember, we said everyone has their own perception of the world. So this includes researchers. So our researchers' age, whether they're male or female, whether they're rich or poor, what their values, what they believe, what their political leanings are, these can all completely influence the way that they perceive a certain conversation to take place, etc. The concept of reflexivity is one that's very important. So reflexivity in qualitative research is the ability for the person doing the research, for the observer, to really recognize what they are bringing to the table. So what their biases might be when they show up to do this research, and declaring them when they're reporting their research. And we'll talk about this again in a little bit. Interviewer moderator bias, what this is referring to is that somebody who is performing an interview or performing a focus group, if they give off any signals to the participants, whether they be facial expressions, changes in body language, the tone of their voice, that can influence the way that participants actually respond to them. And so let's say something very shocking was said. Well, if the interviewer behaves as if they're absolutely mortified by what was just said, the participants may very much change the tone and direction of the conversation they were having just based on the body language of the interviewer. Biased questions or leading questions, these are when the interviewer or the moderator of the focus group is posing questions in such a way that they're directing what type of an answer they're expecting to hear. And this is actually very hard to get away from, and you're going to see it in quite a few examples, including the one that you are going to be reading today. And the last one we'll talk about is what's called dominant responder bias. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with someone in your life who is a very outspoken, loud individual who is not shy of crowds. Well, if you are running a focus group and you have one of these individuals in your group, this person is going to be a person that is often speaking up, and in some cases drowning out the people around them. And if you have somebody who is very inexperienced at doing qualitative research, running this focus group, and not controlling this individual, when you go to just read the transcript and extract from that transcript of that focus group, that one individual's opinion is going to be highly represented, whereas the quiet individuals in the room are going to be underrepresented. And so a very good moderator is somebody who can recognize individuals who have the dominant respondent persona and essentially direct the focus group to certainly allow them to contribute, but not allow them to take over the focus group. All right, so that's sort of my blurb on qualitative research. Just like the other forms of research, there are checklists that have been developed to try and ensure that the reporting of qualitative research is done in a very systematic way that ensures transparency and coherency across studies. And the group that organized this in qualitative research is called CORIC, which is the Consolidated Criteria for Reporting Qualitative Research. And I have to say that compared to the other two fields, so in randomized controlled trials or clinical trials and in diagnostic testing, a format for standardized reporting is highly, it's looked upon very highly. Whereas in qualitative research, this was really sort of a struggle for a lot of people to come around to the idea that there should be a format of standardized reporting. Some people really felt that this was taking away from the true meaning of what qualitative research was. However, this does seem to be changing, and there's quite a few more individuals now really using this framework when they're reporting qualitative research. When you look at the core checklist, it actually looks very different from some of the other ones we've looked at. It's not as highly structured. The CORIC is divided up into 3 primary domains. So the first is a research team and reflexivity. The second is related to study design, and the third is related to analysis and findings. So if you take a look at just the very first domain, as I said, this whole domain is focusing on the concept of who is doing this research and what are they bringing to the table. What type of influences might these individuals actually be having on the outcome of this research? And a lot of this focuses on the concept of reflexivity, as I said. So reflexivity, somebody who is using a high degree of reflexivity in their reporting of qualitative research, is someone that is being very aware of his or her effect or impact on the outcomes of that research. So what are they, as I said, bringing to the table that might impact how that research plays out? And so some of the things that really may impact reflexivity are things related to who that actual person is. And so a very well done qualitative research report, the people will describe who they are very clearly. They're going to talk about who they are, what their credentials are, what their job is, and really sort of what experience they have in performing qualitative research. Often they won't specifically outright say what their gender is, but certainly looking at that, and the example I gave in class, for example, is let's say you're doing a focus group related to somebody's experiences with yeast infections. So clearly you're going to have a group of sort of middle-aged, young to middle-aged women in the focus group. And if you put in that room a interviewer or moderator who is a young male, you may not get very honest or trustworthy information coming from these individuals in the focus group. And so knowing who is actually running the focus group is tremendously important. And it's not to say that certain individuals can't run these focus groups, but certainly by reporting who they are, it allows you to have a greater understanding of how credible the results are for that study. They should also, in the report, discuss their relationships with the participants. So clearly, if you're having these intimate conversations with individuals that may last hours in some cases, a relationship will begin to develop and conversations change accordingly. And so the individual who is reporting the results of this should talk about how many times they met with the participants, how long they met with the participants, etc. So you can have an idea of what the relationship was between the investigator and the participants. And so all of those concepts that I just sort of briefly talked about all fall under domain 1 of the CORIC checklist. So a third of the checklist is focused on who did the research. The second domain focuses on study design, so they should clearly tell you what type of study design they were using, whether they were coming from a grounded theory approach, an ethnography approach, or phenomenology approach. Sometimes you will see this explicitly stated in the title, and then in other cases you won't see this ever mentioned whatsoever throughout the entire paper. You do want to take a peek in the methods section and try and understand what it is that they were doing. So were they understanding experiences, phenomenology? Were they trying to understand characteristics about a group of people or a culture, or the ethnography? Were they trying to study phenomena and come up with a theory about behavior or experiences? That would be grounded theory. So sometimes they may not say it, but you can allude what their framework was. Very importantly, how did they get the people into their study? This is going to allow you to look at concepts related to selection bias. So a good example, in the article that you're to read for this lecture, they recruited individuals using an online Facebook page and online Craigslist. So certainly the people who responded to take part in this study have access to the internet and obviously use the internet quite a bit. In their interview, they specifically asked individuals what modality would they be most happy about if they were looking at an intervention for cardiovascular health. And they came up with a conclusion that these individuals thought that an online modality would be the most effective one. You do have to ask yourself, is there some selection bias at play here? Were these individuals more likely to select an online modality because these were individuals selected through an online form? If they had selected people who strictly responded to a notice that was pasted on the wall of the library, would they also have chosen that same modality as the most favorite one? And that's up for debate. Very importantly is this last point down here, which is related to sample size. So I'm sure you were very familiar that when we did our sample size calculations for our clinical trials, there were quite a few pieces of information that we needed to put in, and this was a very big deal. If people don't explain their sample size, it's really considered a major weakness of the study. In qualitative research, however, there is no such thing as a sample size calculation. So power calculations are not at all relevant. Instead, they talk about what's called data saturation. And probably the best example of this, again, coming from an example from a podcast I was recently listening to, was an individual who was going around and asking every single person they met if they could have a superpower, what superpower would it be? And after asking about 10 to 15, maybe 20 people, you start hearing the same answer over and over and over and over again. And that is referred to data saturation. At some point, you're going to hit some number of people, at which point you're not getting any new responses. And so there's no magical equation to figure out at what point you're going to hit data saturation. This is up to the purview of the researchers to come up to the conclusion that at some point they are starting to just hear the same answers over and over again. They're not learning anymore by interviewing more people. And at that point, they can call their data set saturated and stop collecting data. The interviewers should also discuss the setting. So where did this interview or focus group take place? So let's talk about a focus group that was done over telephone, and it was related to sexual practices or STDs, for example. If you were doing this with a group of individuals and you were calling them, and you called an individual who happens to be at work and is working in a cubicle with individuals very close by, their ability to, or willingness to really answer the questions truthfully and honestly is probably very limited in that setting. So it's very, very important for them to understand, for the reporters to tell you where this focus group took place. Where were these people when they were answering these questions? You should understand what the basic demographics of those participants were. This is again going to give you an idea a little bit about selection bias, as well as any presence of people who are not actually participating, where there's some third parties sitting there that may have influenced this in any way. They should tell you how the data was collected or give you information related to data collection. So they should give you an idea of what types of questions were asked, either in an interview or in a focus group, or what prompts were used to drive the discussion. They should give you an idea of how the data was recorded and transcribed, how long the interview or focus group went on for, and how they determined when data saturation was actually achieved. And here's just a summary of all of those different components of the second study design domain. And the last domain of a correct checklist is related to data analysis and reporting of the findings. So you certainly want to hear from the researchers whether any forms of triangulation was included. So again, did they use multiple sources to collect the data? Did they analyze the data using multiple interviewers, etc.? And this should be explicitly discussed in the methods section of the paper. If this was transcripts and they were trying to extract common themes, how were the data coded? How were themes identified? this should all be explicitly stated. And in some cases, it may be as simple as saying, data was transcribed and using 2 or 3 different extractors. We looked for common words and themes using such and such software program, because these software programs really can help out in doing this type of analysis. And the one thing that can happen in qualitative research that you don't see at all in quantitative research is one way to really ensure validity or truthness behind the data that was collected is in some cases the researchers will collect the data, they will perform some form of analysis to try and identify common themes within the data that they've collected, and then they will actually go back to the participants who took part in the research and show them the data that they collected and ask them if they believe that this version or their telling of this experience is actually in fact as true as this person remembers it to be. And this can really help ensure that they were not sort of influenced by their own personal biases. When they are reporting their analyses, if you read a qualitative research document, and certainly the one I've provided you here today is a good example of that, they should provide you with lots of direct quotes that came from participants so you can understand what was said and provide some context to their conclusions. And were multiple participants saying the same thing, or did one person say it and they cherry picked that one conversation? So they should give you an idea of that. And again, here are sort of the concepts that are reported in that third domain. And I'm not going to go through it in this lecture, but certainly CASP, as I said, has a very good document that walks you through trying to make sense of qualitative research. And again, a lot of these questions are related to what we saw in the COREC. So are the results valid? So can you believe the results? What are the results themselves? One thing that comes out in the CASP checklist that isn't as prevalent in the COREC is this concept of whether the results that are generated, will they actually help locally, or will they help with the population that you might be interested in? So this is really exploring this concept of generalizability or external validity. How well are the results that collected transferable to other populations? And here's just another one here. Okay. So at this point in the lecture, obviously we took a break, and then I offered the students the ability to work on this article. So if you have not done this, I would recommend reading this. It's up on your Blackboard. It is a qualitative study that looks at the risk of cardiovascular disease in women who have had preeclampsia using a focus group. So I would certainly recommend taking a peek at that, trying to think about some of the concepts that we've talked about in this lecture. Look at the COREC and try and see if you can answer some of those questions, as well as the CASP. This is one of the papers that you can choose to use for your assignment if you want to. And if you have any questions related to that, I'm certainly happy to answer those. You can just send me an email. And with that, I think I'm going to shut this down, and I will see you all next week.